Start increasing your influence and maximizing your potential with Ria's audiobooks. Available at audible.com, amazon.com, and iBooks. Please visit riastory.com to learn about Ria's books, resources, speaking, and training programs. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fearfully and Wonderfully Me, a podcast designed to help you become the leader you are destined to be. Welcome to today's episode. Today's episode is on a book that I read recently by Viktor Frankl called Yes to Life. And I wanted to share this with you. If you've been listening to my podcast for a while, I'm a big reader because it's one of the ways that I ensure my personal growth. And so I usually like to read one nonfiction book a week so that I get 50 nonfiction books throughout the year. And that's a pretty big goal. And, when I set that goal for myself, the main qualification is it just has to be a nonfiction book that I can learn from. Because I think every book that I read, I get at least one piece of wisdom or one quote or one nugget of something. And, that's just a way that I help ensure my continued growth. And, throughout the year, some books, I might only get one or two nuggets of wisdom or gems, so to speak. But some books really stand out, when I look back through my list of books that I've read through the year. And at the end of the year, what I like to do is just do a short podcast and say, hey, here were the top 5, and this is why they were the top 5 for the year. But when I read this book, and I just read it recently, I didn't even know about this book. I've read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, several times, and it's a phenomenal book. If you haven't read it, if you're not familiar with Frankl's story, he was Jewish, and he was a prisoner in World War II in a concentration camp. And after he was arrested and deported with his family, he was working on a book, and he sewed the material, the manuscript for the book, inside his coat because he was afraid that they would confiscate it. So he sewed it into the lining of his coat, and of course they took the coat away, and so he lost. Right away when he was arrested and deported, he lost the coat and the manuscript. But not only that, he lost his parents. Both his parents did not survive the concentration camp, and his brother and his wife, who was carrying their child at the time. And so when you look at that, and Frankl was a prisoner for years in the concentration camps, and he lost everything, right? I mean, he lost his family, his parents, his spouse, his life's work in a manuscript. And you have to, I don't think any of us today can appreciate the depths of what he went through. But when he was released, when the war ended and he was liberated, in just a few days, I think it was 9 days, just shortly after he was liberated, he sat down and he recreated the manuscript that he had lost, but he also included much of his experience in the concentration camp. And it's a phenomenal book because it talks about finding meaning in our lives, particularly in light of suffering, because I think that's something that we all struggle with is, if we're Christians and we accept that God loves us and cares for us and wants the best for us, then sometimes it's difficult to reconcile why bad things happen, right? We know God wants the best for us and he has a plan, but it's very difficult to see from our point of view how sometimes things are part of his plan. Why do bad things happen? I spend a lot of time wondering, questioning, well, God, if you're a good and kind, loving God, why did I go through the abuse that I experienced at growing up? And so many others who go through such terrible things. So, that book really, it was powerful. It helped me put some perspective on things. And so I highly recommend it. But it's been a while since I've read Man's Search for Meaning. And I was listening to a podcast, I think it was a video. I think it was a video by Edith Eger. And if you don't know her, she's also a survivor of the Holocaust. And she was talking about Viktor Frankl's new book. And now, Viktor Frankl has passed away, and so I wasn't aware of any new book. So I'd jump on Amazon and look and search for the book, and sure enough, it's basically just a collection of a couple of lectures that he did. And so what he did after he gave the lectures is he kind of summarized his notes and his key points from the lectures and compiled these together. And this was published just a few months ago, obviously after he passed away. But, so I was excited because it was just something I hadn't read, some new material from him and a different perspective. So the book is called Yes to Life in Spite of Everything. And, I love that theme because it's just one that's dear to my heart, obviously. And so I ordered it, and I think it came like on a Friday, and I read it just in that weekend. It was just something I couldn't wait to dig into. And it's not a big book, but I wanted to share with you some of the quotes that I picked up from this book and kind of some thoughts on them, because I think they're just so relevant to many of us in dealing with adversity or struggles or trials or learning to become resilient. How do we say yes to life, right? That's a really good question. Is sometimes bad things are happening, or you're struggling with something. I mean, that's not uncommon, but how do we say yes to life in spite of everything? Because we're all going to go through the everything, but how do we keep in mind, particularly as Christians, saying yes to God's plan for us, even if we don't understand it, saying yes to what life brings, even if though sometimes it's not pleasant, fun, or sometimes it's downright painful or tough. And I know that's a challenge for all of us, but we absolutely can do it. It's a choice that we make. It's not always an easy choice, but it is a choice that we make. So just a couple of quotes here from Viktor Frankl. He says, one of the first ones that stood out to me in the book is he says, "A human being should never become a means to an end." And I loved that because I think a lot of times, if we don't have great character, if we don't develop our character, if we don't work on ourselves, it's very easy to get into the mindset of using other people to get what we want. And what I mean by that is maybe you've had the experience in your career working for a leader or a boss who did not care about you, who didn't value you as a person. They just wanted you to fill a job and get the job done and fill a role. And I know I've had an experience like that. And that's a situation where, in that case, that poor leader with poor character is using a human being as a means to an end, right? And it's a different way to think about it. Maybe it's different than how Viktor Frankl meant it, but I think that's relevant for where our culture is today, where a lot of times employees or team members aren't always valued for who they are as people. They're just a means to an end or someone to fill a role in a job. And so it's a good reflection or a good point that we should always remember to value the human being for who they are, right? We're not in the business of using people, and we shouldn't be in the business of using people, or trying to manipulate someone. Someone who is trying to manipulate us loses our trust, and they can't influence us very well. So we have to be careful that we're not trying to use someone else to become a means to an end, or manipulate them, if you wanted to modernize that phrase a little bit, because we will destroy our influence. It doesn't help us in the long run. It might help us achieve a short-term something, but it's not really satisfying, and it really does reveal our character when we try to use other people for anything. If we're trying to manipulate someone else for ourselves or for our own benefit instead of mutual benefit, it says a lot about the state of our character. He goes on to say later on in the lectures in the series that our whole lives, and this is a direct quote, our whole lives would be meaningless were we only to strive for pleasure and nothing else. Pleasure in itself cannot give our existence meaning. Thus, the lack of pleasure cannot take away meaning from life. And I've defined in past and previous podcasts the difference between joy and pleasure. Right? Joy is a choice we make. It's not a product of our circumstances. But pleasure is just simply satisfaction or something that's created by our circumstances, right? If you're sitting somewhere warm and comfortable, you're not hungry, you're driving down the road, but you got your temperature in your car just right, and you're drinking a cup of coffee, right? You can take pleasure in those things. That's a physical state that you're comfortable, nothing's too pressing or stressing, and so you can take pleasure in that. But even if you don't have those things, now I know you're probably not, but if you were sitting outside in the freezing cold and the pouring rain and you're shivering and you're hungry and cold and miserable, there's not a lot of pleasure in that state, but you can still have joy, because joy is a choice that we make. And he's basically saying the same thing, is that pleasure cannot give our existence meaning. The lack of pleasure cannot take away meaning. And so, when we think about that, that's why material things don't give us joy and satisfaction and meaning in life, right? All the money in the world or the biggest house or the nicest car doesn't give us lasting meaning, because you read about people who are famous or actors or wealthy, and yet they're unhappy or maybe they're depressed, because the things around us, the physical things, the material things, don't give us lasting meaning and joy. Our lives have a purpose, and until and unless we take steps to grow toward that purpose and fulfill that, our life will feel empty or lacking meaning. It's almost a cliche about the midlife crisis of someone who wakes up and says, I've worked to be successful, but I don't have any significance in life. Now, there's nothing wrong with being successful. We all want to be successful, but it's almost another level of, after you become successful, then you find significance in fulfilling your purpose and in being significant and helping someone else, right? That's really why we're here, is to find that purpose and fulfill it. Let's see. Another really great quote from this book. It is never a question of where someone is in life or which profession he is in. It is only a matter of how he fills his place and his circle. Whether life is fulfilled doesn't depend on how great one's range of action is, but only whether the circle is filled out. And there again, that really comes back to fulfilling our purpose. I think a lot of us struggle with the idea that purpose has to be big or huge to be meaningful. But we can fulfill our purpose in little ways as well as big ways. And sometimes, until we start making a difference right where we're at in our day-to-day lives and our daily interactions with people, then we might never get to be fulfilling a purpose in a big way, right? There's no hierarchy on purpose of whether it's a greater purpose. As long as we're making a positive difference in the life of someone else, we are growing, we're becoming significant, and we are taking steps toward fulfilling that purpose. So don't wait. I think that's the other perception. I know so many people who want to be a speaker or a successful author, and that's not a bad thing. We all want to make a difference in the lives of many people. Well, maybe not everybody in the world, but if you're listening to a personal growth podcast, I'm going to assume you do. So everyone listening, we all want to make a difference in the lives of other people. But as my friend Tom Telesco says, we all want to make a difference, but do we have with many? We all want to make a difference with many, but do we have the courage to start with one person? Right? And so sometimes it is just about taking steps to make a difference with one person. And if we do that every day, then look how much difference we've made over time. So I really like that. It's just, again, these are the same principles that I talk about or Stephen Covey talks about, that Viktor Frankl talks about, right? With the same principles that we can find in the Bible. And the principles are timeless, but how we apply them looks different for every single one of us. So let's see. He goes on to say, happiness should not, must not, and can never be the goal, but only the outcome of the fulfillment of that which is called duty. And there again, he's saying there that, when we start to live a purpose-driven life, an intentional life is what I would say, that's when we find our true joy and meaning. And just being intentional, comes down to how we intentionally spend our years, but that starts with how we spend our days, which is how we spend our hours and how we spend our minutes. And so when you consider that, only you can decide what an intentional life looks like for you. But for me, I've just had to examine, how I'm stewarding my time, what I'm doing with it. When I look back at yesterday, am I satisfied with how I intentionally spent my time? Or do I think, man, I spent a little too much time scrolling social media? And I realized for myself, especially with all of the pandemic news, the last few months, I started reading more of the news and paying attention to more of the news. And just because there was so much going on and so much news, so much more news to pay attention to. And what I realized is in the last couple of weeks or so that I wanted to dial that down. Maybe during the crisis that was appropriate, but now I want to be spending my time a little more intentionally, because at this point, it's just the same old news. There's nothing new. There's no I'm not really gaining anything by spending more time reading more pandemic news, because it's all been said, I feel like at this point. So that's just an example of how I've kind of been a little more intentional this week of, okay, I need to stop letting my attention go to so much of the news and start being a little more intentional with what I can do or should be doing with that time and energy instead. And there again, I'm not saying that watching the news or reading the news is bad, but just challenging you to think about how you are intentionally spending, not your years, but how you're intentionally spending your days and your minutes and your hours in the day, because that's what determines how we spend our years, how we spend our lives. Just be intentional about, is this helping me fulfill my purpose or becoming the person that I want to be? And there again, every time I talk about being intentional and how we steward our time and choices, there's absolutely a place for recreation. Mac and I took a day recently. We drove a couple hours to a state park or national forest and had a really great hike, and then we drove back. Of course, that's something you can do without while you're social distancing and all of that. And it was just a day of recreation. We didn't do much work, didn't do a lot. It was just a downtime day to relax and refresh and get outside. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all need time for recreation, for recreation, and renewal. So don't think that I'm bashing those times when you're like, hey, I just need a day off. I just want to sit down and read a good book that is fiction. There's nothing wrong with that. If you want to take a bubble bath, if whatever your way of renewal and refreshment is fine. But what I am saying is just being intentional to make sure that doesn't consume more of your time than it should. And I think Frankl is saying something along the same lines there. Okay, just a couple of more. I love this one because he says, it is not only through our actions that we can give life meaning, but also as loving human beings in our loving dedication to the beautiful, the great, and the good. And when I read that, it reminds me of kind of something along the lines of what Bob Goff talks about in, his books, Everybody Always and Love Does. And I love both of those books by Bob Goff. One of those were, or both of those were on my list last year of great books that I read. Because, when I read the books like that, or when I read this quote from Viktor Frankl, it just reminds me that as Christians, we already have accepted the belief that God loves us, and that some of what we're challenged to do is represent that to other people. And, I think a lot of times we spend so much of our time and energy as humans wanting to judge other people, or correct other people, or criticize other people. And, I think that our challenge as leaders is to make sure that first we care about that other person. And if we care about the other person or love the other person, then our desire to help the other person comes across more as helping and positive influence instead of criticism and judgment. And that's important because every single one of us know that we are not perfect, right? And so it's very easy to get caught up in saying that someone else should do something different, or someone else should say something different. But we're challenged above all to live the example. And I think that's where our greatest influence comes, is living that example. And that's huge when we think about that, because the majority of our influence doesn't come from what we say. It comes from what we do, right? Our actions always set a greater example than our words ever will. And so make sure that we're reflecting that. If we're trying to influence people in a positive way, we first have to care about them. We have to love them at some level. There are different forms of love, certainly, but we have to care about somebody in order to truly value them and add value to them and influence them at a high level. And so just a reminder that not just what we do that gives life meaning, but also, there again, who we are. And then last quote, and this one was probably my favorite in this whole book, because I'm a big fan, or one of the things that I like to say is belief drives behavior, right? Because what we believe about ourselves, about the world, about our purpose or our meaning, or anything else, what we believe is going to drive our actions, our behaviors, our choices. So belief drives behavior. And it's one of the things that it's just such a powerful reminder for me. And it's one of the things that I put on the coffee cups I had done for Fearfully and Wonderfully Me. There are a couple different versions. One of them says, potential is realized one choice at a time. And the other part, the other coffee mug, says belief drives behavior. And because it's just such a reminder that what we believe determines how we behave. And so when I read this quote by Viktor Frankl, I was like, that's exactly what I mean when I say that. He just said it a little differently. Now, granted, he's saying it, obviously, these lectures that he was given was early in the 1940s, or later in the 1940s. So language was different. We talked differently. And of course, he said it in a different language. And I'm reading the translated English version. But it's basically, we're saying the same thing. And so it, again, was just kind of a reminder of how true these principles are. So the quote that he says in this book, belief brings into being that which is believed. And when I read that, I was like, that's exactly what I'm saying. When I say belief drives behavior, right? What we believe is what we do, and that determines what we can achieve. So, and he says, belief brings into being that which is believed, right? You've heard the cliche that if you believe it, you can achieve it. Maybe not. But if you don't believe it, you're not going to achieve it, right? When you think of whatever you want to do or accomplish, you have to believe it. And maybe you don't quite believe it, but sometimes you can borrow someone else's belief in yourself and your abilities. And if that's the case, then please borrow mine, because most of the time, what holds us back from accomplishing whatever it is we want isn't the fact that we absolutely cannot do it. It's the fact that we either don't believe it or we aren't willing to make the sacrifices to do it. So there you have it. My favorite few quotes and nuggets of wisdom from Viktor Frankl's book, Yes to Life in Spite of Everything. Until next time.